Hello YouTube, Poopslag here, and this is TurboFat, an open source video game I'm developing using the Godot engine. You can find a link to the GitHub page in the description below. And this month, my goal for the game was to port it to Android, iOS, and HTML5, because I could port it a year from now if I wanted, but if when I tried to port it, I found out that all the art needed to be smaller, or it didn't support 3D at all or something, that would sort of be a showstopper. I wouldn't be able to port it at that point because I'd have to redraw all the art or pretty much rewrite the entire game. So I wanted to knock that stuff out early and figure out any total roadblocks. However, the porting process ended up not taking very long, so I actually had some extra time, so I got to do some fun stuff at the end too, which I will show off later in the video. Anyways, let's get started. So the previous version of TurboFat had this cool 3D overworld, which sadly I did have to get rid of it and replace it with a 2D alternative because the 3D stuff wasn't supported in HTML5 and I wanted this to work on the web if possible. But the 2D version does everything the old one did. It's obviously a lot easier to work in 2D than 3D, with one exception, which was cameras. In 3D, you could just mindlessly say switch from this camera to that camera, and it would sort of smoothly transition from one to the other. But 2D looked terrible. It would just jump. So I had to come up with a replacement. So what I came up with was a pretty complicated 2D camera which behaves like two cameras conceptually. It has a camera A, which is the zoomed out camera when this close-up percent is 0, which shows you all the area around your character, and then it has a camera B, the zoomed in one, when this close-up percent is 1, which just shows you and the person you're talking to in a tighter focus. And then it has this tween, which handles smoothly adjusting that close-up percent from 0 to 1. And then it also has these two lerps to just make it extra smooth, I guess. Seems sort of redundant, but it looked better this way, so that's what I came up with. So I added gamepad support. You can play with the gamepad now. I wanted to get that out of the way early just in case the controls didn't make sense on the gamepad and it warranted changing the gameplay in some way, but it feels pretty smooth. So one problem I did not see coming is that on a keyboard, you expect escape to be used for bringing up a pause menu and also to close it, and to cancel out of menus, because it sort of does both. It's the menu and the cancel button. But on a joystick, you really expect start to be the menu. That's how pop-up menus, and B or Y or something is cancel. You expect to hit a button to cancel out. If you went forward in a menu and I told you have to hit start to back out of the menu, you'd think I was crazy, right? So you got one button on the keyboard, but two buttons on the gamepad. And that's sort of a nightmare, especially because you cannot bind two actions to a button in Godot. So as a workaround, I created this shortcut helper kludge class, which you can hang off of a node like this OK button here, and give it an action, and it will activate its parent button if that action's pressed. So that's my way of giving the controller the ability to press a button, whether you hit the back button or the start button. So one other problem I wanted to get ahead of was the long startup times. They're not that long. They right now take about 5 or 10 seconds. Crunch, 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 loads all these little resources, and now you can play. But the game's only like 10% complete. So by the time it's done, this could be like 50, 100 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever. It needed to be way faster. And the reason why it was slow, when I ran some benchmarks, I found out it was loading these giant sprite sheets, and that was taking a while. Just this one guy who's 8,000 by 5,000 pixels, this one sprite sheet takes about a half a second to load, and there are a lot that are very similar to it. And the reason it's arranged this way is because this is just one part of the creature. This is its mouth, but it needs to be animated independently and moved left and right as he opens and closes his mouth and stuff like that. So it's arranged for simplicity of coding, but that doesn't mean there's all this dead space between these cells. So if we crush this using ASE Prite and get rid of all that dead space, it's now a very compact 800 by 400 pixels, which Godot loads in a snap. It takes no time, but Godot doesn't read this sort of format. It can't handle a packed sprite where like, oh, the first cell is at 0, 0, but the next one's like twice as big and half as high. It doesn't understand that. So I had to do a little legwork to get Godot to talk to ASE Prite and to understand its format. So I ended up writing this little packed sprite class, which only actually has about 20 or 30 lines of actual code. The first piece of code here is what reads these JSON files and stores all that frame data as far as how big each frame is and where it is on the PNG. It stores it into memory. And then the second part is what draws the specific section of that frame to the screen. So it knows if I'm drawing, frame 1, then I need to specifically draw that little part to the screen. So overall, a lot less code than I expected. I did have a few false starts. The biggest false start was trying to make this be an actual sprite. This is not a sprite, this is just a Node 2D, which has some custom drawing logic. The problem with making it a sprite is that sprite has its own concept of here's how big my frames are and here's how many are in memory. And so it was sort of fighting with me when I tried to use Sprite. So, but making it in OTD, this was pretty smooth, pretty clean. It will not probably work if you just drop it in your own project. It's not 100%, you know, but it does what I need it to do for now. So with those fixes in place, the game got to where it took about 2 or 3 seconds to launch, which is a lot better, but I knew I could still make it a little faster. And one way I measured with the benchmarks, another bottleneck, was this little oval texture around the chat here where it says, wow, you finally did it, and there's a little pretty oval. Okay. Well, that texture is something I drew, and there's different sizes of those textures based on whether he's saying something long or saying something short, like this one's a little bigger. So yeah, there are a couple big textures for that stuff, and I realized I could just generate that, and it'll look 90% as good. So here's the new one. It's, you know, just a flat rectangle with corners, little pretty round corners, but so maybe a little less personality, but now I don't have to have these giant PNGs floating around, and the game starts up faster without them. And the last thing I did to eke out a few extra milliseconds of performance was to multi-thread the resource loading. So instead of loading all the images and music sequentially, it has 4 threads which load them all at the same time. And that does make it about 3 times faster. And here's the result. You launch the game and bam! Well, it certainly doesn't take 10 seconds anymore. Blink and you'll miss it. So there you go. So one other thing I really wanted to get done this month was the Android stuff, and it is there. So the mobile port is working. The mobile buttons and all the touchscreen stuff works. I could not get iOS because I thought I would have to buy like an iPad or an iPhone or something. I was okay with that, but it turns out to do any iOS development, you also have to buy a Mac, and I'm not going to buy a second computer just for one platform, but maybe someday I will, who knows. But for now, the mobile controls, I'm really happy with them. I'm up to 2 Dan. I can't remember if it's 2 or 3. I don't think I've beaten 3 Dan, but 2 Dan is pretty good. Like honestly, I think most people who pick up the game casually will not get to the 2 Dan level, and I can do it on mobile. So I'm really happy with the mobile controls, and they're also pretty heavily customizable, where they support a lot of different arrangements based on, you know, if you're used to keyboard, you probably want the movement on the right, but you can swap that. And if you're crazy, you might actually want like, oh, the movement is on the left, but I really want left and right to be next to each other so I can switch fast. So it supports all sorts of crazy control schemes if that is your thing. And so yeah, happy with that. So on that note, the game is also now available on itch.io, so you can play it in your browser. I'm still not trying to make it too public because there's still not much game to it left. It is still just, you know, doing the puzzle part and beating your head against a brick wall of difficulty. I'll wait until the story mode is a little bit more developed and then maybe push it out and see if anybody actually wants to play it. But it does work in HTML5. So I knocked all that stuff out in 2 weeks, which actually left me thinking, like, what do I do with the rest of June? That was a lot easier than I expected. So I knocked out a couple small things. One was input buffering, where now, right when a piece spawns, if you used to hit left or right to try and move it like the instant it spawned, if you were a little early, it wouldn't actually move because it was like, well, you were framed too early. I wasn't ready for you. So now it has a little input buffer. The second is this one specific piece kick is really, like, now you can do that, which is very important because that was the only way to get this box in, if you could do that one, the rotate move at the higher speeds. When it's this slow, you can sort of inch your way over there, but at 20G you couldn't, and now that little spin move works. The third coolest thing you might have just seen is, yeah, so now if you make a box like this brown one, you can see that brown frosting sprays around, or that yellow. The yellow is very noticeable. You can see it sticks everywhere, and even to the walls, where like if I stick this brown box over here on the left side, boom, a little brown stuff sticks to the wall on the left side. So that was fun to do. Let me show you how I did that. So to get the frosting to stick to walls, I created a frosting viewports class, which added little frosting glob sprites to 2 child viewports. One viewport for the flat colored frosting and another viewport for the rainbow colored frosting. Those viewports are then applied via viewport textures to a texture rect, which uses a very specific shader that takes as input 3 textures. The wall texture, which acts as a base to which the frosting is applied, and then 2 viewport textures, one for the flat frosting and one for the rainbow colored frosting. Those are all then mixed together with a few mix commands. But yeah, the result looks really pretty. Just look at all that colorful frosting. So I also juiced up squish moves a little, which used to look like this. And now they look more like this. So I got a little sound there, a little bit of sweat and frosting and stuff. A little bit more feedback. So there's nothing too mysterious about this code, just a new Squish Effects node, which handles all the pretty shaking and flashing. It has a curve object which defines how intense the squish effects should be over time, and then the code itself has different functions for handling the piece shaking back and forth, flashing on and off, emitting little sweat droplets, and making the sound effects. Each of those is just little 1 or 2 line methods. There's nothing too complicated here. So something else I snuck in this month was where if you clear lines that have nothing in them, it just makes those little leaves. But if you can get some boxes in a row, then you start getting a little bit more food, like that strawberry and that cookie. Over here we'll get some cherry and another cookie, yep. And then once you clear the last line to beat a level, everything just disappears in a big flurry of food and frosting. And it makes it a lot of fun if you can set up those boxes. Last but definitely not least, Pete Ellison contributed 3 new songs to this release, bringing the total number of songs up to 5. Hopefully you're liking this soundtrack as much as I am, because I'm in love with it so far. Can't wait to see where it goes. I also added a little logic where when you start up the game, it might start the song in the middle now, but not at a random point. It'll always start it in a place where I think it sounds good. So yeah, that's what we accomplished in the month of June. We got the game successfully ported to Android and HTML5, ditched all the 3D stuff for 2D stuff that was more compatible with other platforms. And yeah, we made the game start up a lot faster, it performs better, and it's more scalable. Now all we really got to do is make the rest of the game. That's, I guess, where next month comes in. I want to flesh out these characters a little more, which means adding like a dialogue system, maybe the beginnings of a creature editor, where you actually have some people you can talk to, and you know, getting the characters to feel a little bit more real. Hope to see you guys next month.